Hi everybody, this is Justin with Shock Therapy, and we are here to show you how to install a dual rate spring kit on an XP Pro. This dual rate spring kit will smooth out the ride quality, stop front and rear bottoming, as well as allow the car to jump flat and level. Our springs are made in the USA and always warranted 100% for life. They are also the first thing that we recommend that you do to your car when it comes to suspension improvement. This installation should take between 2 and 3 hours. So let's go ahead and turn it over to Mitch so he can show us how to put these on.
Hey guys, Mitch here. Today we're going to jump into the install on the dual rate spring kit on the XP Pro.
First, jack the front of the vehicle up until it's off the ground. Use jack stands for safety. Remove the lower shock bolts. Keep in mind that the shocks are side specific and do not switch them from left to right. Unplug the factory wire loom from the shock. Remove the upper shock bolt and remove the shock from the vehicle. With the shock in the vise, push the factory bump stop down the shock shaft approximately 3 to 4 inches. Compress the factory springs and remove the lower spring perch. Remove both springs, but make sure that you save the factory plastic spring divider. With the shock in the vise and the springs removed, you can break the factory preload collars loose from each other. Adjust them to the preload setting of 2 1/4 inches. This is measured from the bridge of the shock to the bottom of the preload collar. Install the 2 one-piece crossover rings on the front shock. They should be set at 5 inches. Make sure that you thread them on so that the recessed groove is facing the top and the bottom of the shock. This way, the O-ring can be installed and has a place to sit inside that recessed groove. Install the silent O-ring onto the crossover. With the shock and the spring compressor, you can install the upper spring. Make sure that you install it with the part number and the Shock Therapy logo the right side up. Next, install the factory spring divider with the long end facing the bottom of the shock. Install the lower spring with the logo facing the correct direction. Make sure that the ends of the springs where they contact the spring divider are on the opposite sides of each other. Compress the system and install the lower spring perch. You can now install the shock back onto the front of the car. Start with the upper bolt first. Install the lower hardware. Install the nuts, but remember to keep the hardware loose so that later in the installation we can make adjustments to ride height much easier. Do not forget to plug in the factory loom to the shock. Repeat these steps on the opposite side.
Flat to flat. Oh, nailed it.
With both shocks installed on the front of the car and the looms plugged back into each shock, you can now let the car back on the ground. Next, jack up the back of the car until the tires are off the ground and use jack stands for safety. Unplug the factory shock wiring loom from the shock. You can now remove one shock from the car. Make sure that you do one at a time, as these are also side specific. Loosen the lower hardware. Remove the upper hardware and remove the shock from the car. With the shock in the vise, lower the factory bump stop on the shaft 2 to 4 inches. Compress the system and remove the rock guard and lower spring perch. Remove both factory springs and divider. Loosen the factory preload collars. Set the preload collars to 3.5 inches. Using the 2-piece crossover supplied in the kit, install this on the shock at 11 3/4. Make sure that the logo is facing the correct direction. When tightening the crossover using the Allen hardware, make sure the gap is equal on both sides. Once again, the setting for this crossover ring is 11 3/4 inch. Install the silent crossover O-ring. With the shock and the spring compressor, you can install the upper spring, making sure that the logo is right side up. Using the supplied spring divider in our kit, install the spring divider with the long end facing the top of the shock. Next, install the lower spring and making sure that the spring ends are on the opposite sides of the spring divider. Compress the system and install the rock guard and lower spring perch. You can now install the shock back on the car, starting with the upper shock bolt. Next, the lower shock bolt. Make sure that you leave all the hardware loose for ride height adjustments later. Do not forget to plug in the factory shock wiring loom. Repeat these steps on the opposite side. With the rear shocks installed back on the car, remove the jack stands and lower the car onto the ground. It's now time to settle the suspension. This must be done by starting the vehicle. The shocks will not function unless the car is actually running. Move the car back and forth using the brakes and the accelerator to settle the suspension properly. If you can drive it around the block, you can do that as well. When you come to a stop for the last time to measure the car, make sure that you do not hit the brakes, but come to a rolling stop. With the suspension settled and the driver remaining in the car, measure the ride heights from the lower control arm rear mount to the ground in the front. It should measure 14.5 inches. The rear of the car is measured from the skid plate at the rear to the ground. This should be 14 inches. The front crossover ring gap should be 1.5 inches from the bottom of the crossover ring to the top of the black spring divider. The rear crossover ring gap should be 2.5 inches. This is measured from the bottom of the crossover ring to the top of the long end of the supplied spring divider. If your ride height is not correct or needs to be adjusted up or down, this is the time where you can remove the shocks because the hardware was left loose and make your adjustments on the spring compressor. The rear shocks can be adjusted on the car, but the fronts have much more clearance problems around them, preventing this from easily being done. We prefer to remove the shock and adjust it on the bench and reinstall it. With your ride heights checked and your crossover ring measurements verified, you can now tighten all the hardware on the shocks. Your installation is now complete.
Mitch, thank you very much for showing us how to install that kit, and we hope that your installation went just as easy as it did for Mitch. As with all of our spring kits, they are brand new springs, and because of that, they will take a set within the first 200 to 300 miles. We always suggest that you check your ride heights after putting that much mileage on your car and adjust accordingly. Also, most people don't remember all of the accessories that they've added to their car. This adds up to weight and can also lower the ride height. Adjust the spring kit accordingly to get the ride height that is recommended for your car. If you like the improvement that this spring kit gave your suspension and ride quality, there's more in store. Look into our ride improvement system. This will modify all of the shock internals and double or even triple the improvement that your spring kit gave you just by modifying the inside of the shocks. It's the ultimate in ride quality. For that and other UTV products, visit us online at shocktherapist.com or call the shop at 623-217-4959.